All right. Let me go back and we'll share the screen. Let me just bounce us through that one more time real fast so that for anyone who just joined. All right, so our beliefs in Islam. 6 main beliefs in Islam. There's one God alone. We agree. Belief in angels, we agree. We talk about them a little bit differently, but generally the same. As far as belief in holy books, we disagree on the Quran, and we don't therefore agree also with the hadiths, the sayings of Muhammad, but Gospels, Psalms, and the Torah, we would agree, but we disagree within interpretation, because again, the same way we read through Gospel, they read through Quran. We have similar belief in the concept of prophets. We would disagree about who some of them were. But again, and we'll talk a lot more later about Jesus and how he fits into that picture. We believe in some sort of last judgment where there will be a reckoning. And again, we believe to some degree in predestination as Christians. There's a variety between someone like Calvin on one end, and the Calvinists versus the Wesleyans and those traditions on the other end. But as Lutherans, we're somewhere in the middle there. But again, we share these general beliefs. We're coming from the same general starting point as a monotheistic religion. So what are the key things we share? To start out, this idea of divine revelation. This is central really to the monotheistic religions, that we don't just stumble upon truths, or we don't just kind of look deep inside and find meaning in truth, but this idea that God is a God who reveals God's very nature. So this idea that whether it's a God speaking from Mount Sinai, or words to prophets to share, or the writing of scriptures, which are not seen as just the insights of people that give us great insight, but that God is revealing the very nature of who God is and God's relationship with all humanity and with creation itself. This is fundamental. And Islam is the same. It is not that all of a sudden some guy, Muhammad, just comes up with some new ideas. He interprets differently. It's the idea that God reveals it. Okay? Now, again, for people who are not in a Muslim tradition, they'd say, well, this was just his interpretation. It wasn't revealed, right? But the nature of all the monotheistic religions is it begins with a specific revelation of God to humans, not that humans just on their own figured out some insight. And so that's an important starting point. And it's an important theological and philosophical difference. And because of that, in monotheism, there has often been different kinds of conflict around this idea of being right, because we have received a revelation from God. It's not like I came up with an interpretation, you came up with an interpretation, and so let's just figure it out or agree to disagree. Sometimes this elevates to a very, we've seen within even our own tradition. Because the idea is this has come directly from God. Does it make sense? We share that. We share monotheism. And I have the asterisk because of the 3 great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they both look at each other and they kind of wink, wink when we all talk about monotheism, because they're like, yeah, you guys are a little loose on that. So we would say, yes, we believe in one God. Where we differ is the idea of Trinity within Christianity, where we have a multiplicity of persons in the Godhead that we say is still one. All right, but the idea that there's one God, that there's one God alone, we fundamentally share that. But again, like all of the monotheistic religions, we look at each other and we go, yeah, but that group didn't quite get that right. They look at us on this monotheism issue and they go, yeah, they kind of fudged a little. And they were really looking for three, but they call it one. Now, again, in Christianity, we have ways of explaining that. Whether deep inside you feel good about how that all logically holds together, right? Like, this is a great debate even among Christians. Like, how do we talk about monotheism in a way that outsiders who don't believe say, oh yeah, that makes sense? It's a difficult concept. And we won't spend a whole lot talking about how the Trinity works, because that can be a whole series of classes. But we would share this idea of monotheism. This idea that all creation stems from God is, again, something that we monotheistic religions share together. That human beings are uniquely created. Where in the Torah, in Genesis, right, we hear about how God creates human beings from the mud and then with his breath. The Quran talks about how human beings are formed from one drop of blood. And so this idea of a divine element, like divine blood, helps create human beings. This is something we share. And in the same way, within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the way you have a very traditional religious view about age of the earth being very recent, right? When Judaism and Christianity, you have that aspect in Islam as well, that the world really isn't that old, which has caused some of the same conflict within Islam that you have in aspects of Judaism and Christianity around evolutionary thinking about long spans of time and all those kinds of things. So similar trajectories. This is something we also share, this idea that human beings sin, that human beings need repentance, and human beings need God's salvation. This is, again, a very Western religious idea. It's a very strong aspect, a central aspect in the monotheistic religions. Now, there are differences in this as well. So Christianity, of the three monotheistic religions, say that because of Adam and Eve, human beings are born sinful, right? Good Christian theology says there's original sin. The classic saying that we are not sinners because we sin because we're sinners. That's a traditional Orthodox Christian view, right? We're born into sin, and we need salvation from the moment we're born, not from when we're old enough to do some bad thing that our parents tell us not to. Within Judaism and Islam, they do not have a category of original sin. That really stems out of Paul and then Augustinian interpretation of Paul and onward. In Judaism, there's this idea that we have the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. You have the good inclination and the bad inclination that are like the good cartoons with the angels and the demon on the shoulder, and like they're all whispering in your ear. Who do you listen to? And in Genesis itself, right, you get this line in chapter 4 when God is having this dialogue with Cain about, hey, sin is crouching at the door, right? You must overcome it. This is the Yetzer Hara, Yetzer Tov idea. In Islam, Adam and Eve become kind of paradigmatic. They're these models that represent how all humans act. That we're not sinful from the beginning, but at some point, real soon, we're going to make the wrong choice. And so in the Quran, it talks about how human beings will continually sin, but it almost reads like, and that's the way God likes it, because as we continually sin, we continually come back asking for repentance, and God continually forgives. This idea, sometimes in Islam, we see God as like cruel, harsh, right? And that's the exact opposite. The way every Jewish prayer begins with this idea of every prayer starts with this idea that, Lord God, who is the master of the universe. Every Islamic prayer begins with this God, the merciful and the compassionate, which comes from God's self-declaration in Exodus 32, when he's passing by Moses, right? The merciful, compassionate, slow to anger. This is how all prayers begin. So this idea of God is continually wanting to forgive us, to make things right, is central to Islamic view of who God is. And the other thing that I just want to point out is the general ethical and moral structure of Islam is, again, very much like the other monotheistic traditions. It's about right relationship with God, right relationship with other people. It's about this idea that the Ummah, the people of God, this Muslim community, supersedes ethnicity, supersedes tribal concerns. Like, we are like one body, like Christianity talks about, this idea of Judaism, right? Like, we are God's people. This is a central part of Islam. And because of that, we have all kinds of descriptions about how we're to be generous, right? The idea of charity, this idea that we're to look out for orphans and for widows, and we are to be accepting of all nationalities and people groups into the community. This idea that we're to help the poor, that all these kinds of things are the same kinds of things we talk about in Christianity. Within that ethical and moral structure, you could argue it's even stricter than the way modern Christianity is developed. It is teetotaling in its view on alcohol. It restricts some kinds of foods because it sees that as not part of like overall bodily purity. It sees the world as a wholeness, the words tawheed. It's this idea that all is interconnected in one. And so everything about how we treat each other, to what we do with our bodies, to how we worship God, to how we do government, society, should all be united around this idea of submission and connectedness with God, which in many ways fits like the way Christianity at least would talk about like what we're doing, right? Like, we shouldn't have like a sacred and a secular, and we only do, Christian stuff here, and then we go into our real lives. Islam works to say a good Muslim shouldn't see that distinction, but all work becomes God. All life becomes worship of God. All things should be part of creating, in Christian language, we'd say kingdom of God, right? This idea of God's work and salvation of all things. Islam kind of has that same structure and mindset. Any questions about that? So the key difference, and I'm talking two broad categories, and this goes with any religion, and Christianity, is to think about and talk about who is Jesus. And this is a really, really complicated one in Islam versus any other religious tradition. Because if you go to Judaism, who is Jesus? Well, he's either a false prophet, or he's a crazy person, or we don't even know who that guy was, or he was a good Jewish teacher that later people like perverted his teaching and made it blasphemy. Or in some religions, it's like, well, he's just a man like any other man. Islam, in some ways, not in some ways, I would say compared to any other non-Christian religious tradition, agrees with us more about Jesus than any other tradition. Like, so for instance, they would say he is a holy man who is born of a virgin, who does miracles, who is the voice of God as a prophet on earth, and he is the penultimate prophet preparing the way for Muhammad. he raises people from the dead, and he does not die and ascends into heaven. And at the end of, he is called Messiah, and at the end of time, he will return to help the final imam in the last days who is fighting against the enemies of God's world. Just like in Revelation, he will come back out of the sky and he will fight against the enemies of God to bring completion to the entire story so that God will then have the great judgment. Like most of that description, if a Christian said that, you'd just be nodding along. Muslims would agree with all of that. Okay? What is different is that in the end, he cannot be divine on any level because there is only one God, God alone. So as soon as anything starts to elevate Jesus beyond a man who speaks on behalf of God, who the Spirit of God is on, or whatever language you want to use, as soon as it crosses beyond anything that could happen to any one of us if God so chose us, it is seen as heresy, blasphemy to a Muslim. So Jesus is not divine. Jesus does not die on a cross. This is also a key difference. And there is tension within the system, within the tradition of Islam about Jesus and the cross. Because some traditions say, yes, he is crucified. Others say, no, he was never crucified. So the ones who have him on a cross say, yes, he was on a cross, but God saves him in the end and releases him and takes him straight up to heaven. Others say that never even happened. Others say, well, he was dead for a few hours. Some say 1 hour, some say 3 hours, some say 7 hours. But then God brings him back. But in the end, they tell of an ascension. So there is no place you can see his body because he's been ascended into heaven from whence he'll come back again one day. So in many ways, you could have a long conversation with a Muslim about Jesus and feel like we were all on the same page about him. But the difference becomes when we look at Christianity, not only is Jesus divine, but the work of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus, becomes central of understanding everything else about our faith. It's not just that Jesus is a spokesman for God. It's not that Jesus just teaches the people of his day about wrong understandings of God. It's not that Jesus just loves people the way God wants us to love people. But Christianity says in the end, and we won't get into this either because we could have a whole series on this, Jesus' death means something that changes some cosmic equation about how we are connected to God, right? Our relationship with God is made complete in death and resurrection of Jesus. So Jesus isn't just a very important spokesperson. He isn't just a very good person who does great things and demonstrates who God is. But in Christianity, Jesus' death and resurrection is really central to the story. It's central to what the whole thing means. To a Muslim, that is the perversion of the people who misinterpreted and understood Jesus. So remember how the Muslims understand the gospel to be part of God's revelation. But the parts of the gospel that have stuff that show this picture of God, of Jesus as divine, and this idea of him dying and resurrecting as it describes, they see that as later corruption of the account. And they don't agree at all with Paul and his interpretation of what Jesus' death and resurrection means. Paul's not considered sacred text. Only the Gospels are, and an interpretation through Quranic understanding and the later hadiths. So it's a really complicated picture, and some of it is kind of like evolving throughout time. It's like the early Jewish-Christian dialogues, which are very polemic, where Judaism is saying things about we believe this, but you realize they're saying it in direct contrast to things that Christianity is saying. Let me see if I can find this one quote that I had. Let me see if I can find this here, because it talks about God in such a way that directly speaks against the creeds, because it makes clear that God doesn't beget or hasn't begotten anything, right? Which is a direct counter. Okay, I don't see this now. I had it and I'll send it later if I can. Let me look one other place here. Yeah, I don't see it. They have this, but there is this passage in one of the later hadiths that is about, God who is God alone. He has begotten no one, right? It's a direct contrast from what the Christians were saying about Jesus. Like any religion that you compare with Christianity, the greatest difference is how we understand Jesus. Okay? Any comments or questions? Yeah.
What do they believe about miracles of Jesus as described in the gospel?
A lot of those gospel stories are retold in the Quran, which verifies them. So there's one that we don't have, though, that's in the Quran that talks about how Jesus, it's a miraculous birth because it's a virgin birth, and there's all this stuff around Mary giving birth, and like a river of water running under her and lifting her up, and a date palm appears by her so she can shake it and keep getting dates to have sustenance. And it sounds some of that echo or has resonance with some of the stuff around the Buddha when he's born and this whole miraculous thing. And the other thing that's similar is right after he's born, in his infancy, Jesus starts to talk. And the Quran talks about that, like that Jesus speaks in infancy. Then there's his other story in his childhood, which is in the infancy gospel of Thomas, that Jesus, as a little boy, takes a bunch of dirt, forms it into a bird and blows on it, and then it comes alive. So there's that story. But then they have Jesus healing blind men, healing lepers. There's a story similar to like the feeding the 5,000 without that kind of detail, but like he miraculously makes a table with all kinds of food, raising the dead. So you have like 6 different miracle stories of Jesus in the Quran, which would make them look at the miracle stories he does in the Gospels and say, well, of course, that's the kind of stuff he did. So they don't deny those. The other major difference between, and I don't know that it's even a difference. It's a shift right now. And this isn't as much about theology as much as I would argue it's about sociology. I just want to take a moment to talk about this. And I don't want to oversimplify, but it's something I bring up a lot with my students, really more just like an essential question to think about. And so I'm going to do the same with you all. I'm not making a hard and firm statement about this, but it's a question I want you to ponder. If you look at a religion like Christianity, and you think about our history and our development, right? That's the beauty of studying church history. You see some really fascinating shifts over time. And when I would teach world religions, I would always, kind of have this essential question that we would play with, that if I sat down in a room with a 2nd or 3rd century Christian and a 21st century Hindu, and we started talking about religion, who would I feel I have more in common with, right? Because there's something about time and development that puts us in many ways similar to people, like, right? If you're a Western American, post-Enlightenment, now postmodern, like, we share a lot of things. And religion shift. When you study church history, you see the shift. If you think about Christianity and you say we began 600 years before Islam, what happens if you look in church history and you go back 600 years?
Crusades.
Right? You're coming out of the Crusades. You're coming out of that whole medieval period, scholasticism, you have Inquisition, right? You're waiting for the explosion of the Reformation. You're under a mindset of Christendom that says there's one way to be Christians and it will control politically, militarily, economically. And when I think about that, and I think about aspects particularly in the Middle East, for all sorts of historical, cultural, sociological reasons, have not moved through modernity and the Industrial Revolution and onward like has happened in the West, I sometimes feel like we're looking at a picture of who Christianity used to be. And so when I hear people say things like, well, Islam is more inherently violent, or Islam is more inherently anti-modern, or Islam is more inherently like controlling or rule-bound, or Islam is more inherently, I don't know that any of that has to do with Islam, but says something about the development in a monotheistic society and its relationship to culture at that time. Now, there are people who write on this in very thoughtful, provocative ways. I'm just not one of them. I'm one of those people who read those things and wrestle with it myself. And so if you step into our world and you acknowledge the fact that there's all kinds of polemic against Islamic and Middle Eastern societies for all kinds of reasons, you realize our position and standing as Western Christians critiquing gets really complicated. So here's what, again, to just be upfront, there are aspects of Islam in our world right now that, under a kind of very strict fundamentalist mindset, has become very anti-Western, anti-Christian, anti-West, to the point of horrible, right, terroristic, militaristic acts. So sometimes people are so uncomfortable about that they try to explain it away as if it has nothing to do with Islam. And I understand, like, at the core of its reality, it's not what Islam is about. But in the same way that I would say the Crusades should not be what Christianity is about, but that's not to deny we did the Crusades, right? We can't just say, hey, those weren't real Christians because they weren't really following Jesus like they should. Well, by that logic, I don't know that any Christians ever follow Jesus as they should. And in the same way, I don't know that any right? The same way you could probably say no Muslim truly submits as they should. So these things are phenomena that come out of different religious perspectives and ways of being in the world. And so this is why I think better understanding and dialogue between religious groups and between real people in religious groups is so important. Because what really comes sometimes from all sides is political propaganda, in media, stereotyping, it affects what we're able to really see and hear. And so, look, we've grown up and lived lives through a very difficult time for Western relationships with Islam in the world. But we, I believe, as church folk, have to be careful not just to jump onto the conventional popular wisdom about, well, Islam is this or Islam is that. Islam's pretty complicated. And in the same way, when Christians around the world do horrible things, I also don't want to say, well, this is what Christianity is at its core. And so where we are in the West and how we see faith working out in a modern world is different than where much of Islam is right now in the world. But that's more sociology and historical development, I believe, than this is the nature of the religion. So I'll stop on that and let me ask your thoughts or your feelings about it. Does that make sense? Would you tend to agree with that outlook, or do you see something different going on? Because, again, you can find pundits on all sides of this who are carrying on these discussions about how we should be really relating to Islamic regimes in the world, to Islamic groups, to Muslims in our own country, right? Like this is very much part of the world we're living in right now. And I feel like there is a trend to try to paint broadly with one brush, which President Obama, as soon as he became elected, worked hard to turn that narrative to say, the U.S. is not against Islam. Islamic countries are our friends. And I mean, he worked hard to do that. And now some of that in other political narratives is being turned on its head, like, oh, he was sidling up to terrorists. So anyway, what are your thoughts or thinking on this issue? Because, I mean, this is right in the center of what's going on in our world today.
I'm glad you brought up President Obama, because when there was a radical event somewhere in the world, he went out of his way not to call it radical Islam. He would refer to it as terrorism. In other words, they were not representing Allah or Muhammad or the religion of Islam. They were way off base and they were just renegade terrorists. He got a lot of praise for that. He got a lot of criticism for that, depending upon one's point of view. But he did try to make it separate the acts and the politics from the religion. I'm not sure he accomplished his goal.
Right.
But I think what you're saying is he probably was on the right track.
Yeah.
And yet, the same could have been said for some in Christianity, for people like the Klan. They say they represent Christianity, yet all of us would distance ourselves from them and their acts, saying this is not Christianity. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I guess on the one hand, we could study Christianity, we could study Islam to try to understand what they're all about. And yet at the same time, we have to study ourselves and our point in history, our place in history, at point in time, our culture, how that influences us, how their culture influences them.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to have anything intelligent to say about other than to make sense out of all that,
Right.
which we usually can't.
Let me just point out a couple, like to your point exactly, and then think about one of the ways for people who didn't agree, their way of then trying to tarnish Obama was saying he's really a Muslim,
Right.
right? No matter the fact you've been going to church all his life and it said over and over, no, I'm actually a Christian. No, but we all know he's a closet Muslim.
Right.
And he's going to empower those people, right? Like that became even more clear that us, them.
Right.
But one of the people who's so interesting, I think, on this topic is Thomas Friedman, the journalist and writer. Because in his own writing on the Middle East, in what they call the Lexus and the Olive Tree is where it starts, and it continues through all different things. But even in his The World is Flat, and in the follow-up Hot, Flat, and Crowded, he talks about how in these Middle Eastern Islamic countries, you have issues with modernity, which is making like an anti-modernity perspective, sometimes anti-science, which forces people into a certain kind of study, he said, which is limiting them. And then the more the country struggles economically, the easier it is to then point to the West as somehow to blame. And then he has this other really interesting graphic where he demonstrates how the more oppressive a regime has to do with how much oil they have. Because the more oil they have, the more they can subsidize the living standard of people, but at the same time be very despotic. But then as oil decreases or they don't have oil, those tend to be the more democratic leaning countries in the Islamic world. And religion plays a role in that as well. So it's a really complicated picture in the Middle East. But again, one of these things that people need to think about when they think about Muslims in the world is that only something like 22 to 25% of Muslims are in the Middle East. It starts as a Middle Eastern religion and it's still linked to the Arabic language. But there are more in Asia by far, populations in Europe and all over the place. And so it's not just a Middle Eastern religion, but that sets the tone of how people think about it and talk about it. Other thoughts?
Well, the whole
Well, I think-
concept of the development time is completely new to me. So I'm gonna give it some thought, but I thought it was interesting how you could just take the 600 years and it would fit so well. That doesn't seem to me to be an accident, just off the top of my head.
Right. It's caused certain people, even within Islam, to say we're at that point now where we need our Martin Luther. I think I've mentioned that before, right? That we need the reformer who allows we look at Christianity right now and we think, dear Lord, why do we have a religion with like 1,000 different denominations? But they look at Islam where you have so limited ways of, right, presenting a tradition. And they're saying, this is our time. This is our time to have Quran. It's already translated in all kinds of languages. But like I said, it's always said not to be the true word of God unless it's in Arabic. We need those kinds of shifts said by insiders, right? But I look at it from the outside and say, that does make sense. Again, maybe it's an oversimplification, but I think there is something there. John, I think, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I would venture that a lot of Western Christians, especially American Christians, forget where Christianity started.
Mm.
And if they know, they forget. It's an American religion.
Yeah.
It's all about me. It's the West.
Right, right.
That's because Jesus was blonde. Don't you remember that?
Exactly, right. And the Bible was written in German and all of those. That's
Yeah. Who knew?
Which I bring up again, my favorite bumper sticker that I have sitting in my desk at my office that says, if it ain't King James, it ain't Bible.
That's right. That's right.
They work backwards to Hebrew from there. Other thoughts?
What
was
would we
kind of
say?
late. Go ahead, Fred.
What would we say if there were a group of Muslims that started marching in the United States? Muslim lives matter. It seems to me that Christianity, in its many divisions, has evolved and is still evolving. There are some significant differences, especially here in the United States, but I think elsewhere as well. Islam has evolved irregularly across differently in different places, just as Christianity has been. Um, it's kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, and not to oversimplify, this is where getting to know actual people,
Yeah.
who are actual Muslims who actually do this stuff is really, really helpful. Because it's interesting, because if I can study Christianity and after 4 weeks of PowerPoints on it, you hope that you scratch the surface of what it's really about to gain the essence, but it's in the lived religious experience of people that you start to get the true picture of it. And again, that's where, for me, over the years, getting to know and spend some quality time talking and do life near and around people who are Muslim kind of changes that. And it broke down for me all kinds of things that were like cognitive categories versus parts of things that are in the minds of actual adherents. Because I could quiz most Christians on most of the things that we say Christians are supposed to do, think, and believe. And they'd look at this PowerPoint and go, huh, I didn't really understand it that way, but I guess, right? Because that's where formal religion versus popular religion vary. So one of the things I've yet to do, and I want to do it one of these years, we have intersessions at CHCA. I want to do an intersession on Islam and then figure out how to do a long weekend up in Dearborn, Michigan, where the kids could live with some host families for a few days.
Wow.
And see, like, oh, this is what living an Islamic life looks like when you're really just a Midwestern American kid, right? It doesn't mean you got to dress all differently and be in Saudi Arabia and the women can't drive, right? Because all of a sudden you think, well, that's what Islam means. That isn't what Islam means in Dearborn, Michigan, where you have a bunch of Muslims who go to high schools that look like ours and they play football and they do all the good old American kinds of things, right? And it changes the equation. So, well, I hope this has been helpful for people to just kind of have a framework. Actually, I have was someone else to have a comment? Let me go to the galley view.
I was going to comment, Dean, but you kind of touched on it a little bit. I get really hung up with the Islam with the women, and it just seems that they're treated so much differently. In fact, after our last session, I went I Googled women in the Hajj, and if you're under 45, you have to go with a male, but if you're over 45, you don't. But when the Islam women or Muslim women are like in the grocery store and they're set apart, to me that's it's like they're in their own community. It doesn't invite anything. I mean, even a hi, how are you kind of thing.
Right.
It's hard to break through that.
And that's an interesting thing, because I see that as linked to the Middle Eastern origin of the religion. So if you encounter women in the Middle East, doesn't matter if you're a Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew, the more traditional you are, right, the more elevated the male the more patriarchal that society is. At the same time, right? So if you looked at a Hasidic woman, you'd think, oh my Lord, like how can you live like this? But in other aspects, Judaism has probably been the most progressive religion on feminism known in the history of the world, right? Like Israel had Golda Meir as a prime minister
Been in the army.
near its founding, right? And women's in combat roles in the military. And so there's this really traditional Middle Eastern aspect of it. If you look at Muslim women in America and the number of them who hold like high level professional degrees and occupations as doctors and lawyers. So again, it's not inherent in the religion because the actual Quranic language and the stuff that Muhammad says, he was seen as like this cuckold man whose wives, the women, had too much control over him because he was elevating the status of women in society. But the way that gets interpreted in every different culture. So this always comes up when we're at the mosque and we're like, okay, well, if it's progressive in the West, in Westchester, they're like, why do the women have to be at the back when they pray? And you know what they say to that? It's like, because we're kneeling down and bending down on the ground and we don't want all the men looking at our rear ends. So it's on our behalf that we stay in the back. It's like, oh. And they're like, well, why do you have to cover your heads? And like, I don't have to, but this is what we do for like humility. And so it's interpreted in a way that's seen as like protective and not as demeaning, but you can use those same traditions and interpret them in another place that way. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, because my interpretation is the sum of my experiences,
Right.
and theirs is totally different.
I mean, because think of the same thing within Christianity, right? Think of the same thing within Christianity within Lutheran denominations. The way we interpret what we're supposed to do about genders and gender roles. So Islam would be the same way. But again, and I'm forgetting her name off the top of my head. I have like 2 of her books. And the last one's a really funny one where she's like interviewing her dog. And she's saying all this profound stuff about society and culture, but she's getting it through her interviewing of her dog. She is this powerful Muslim lesbian woman who there's all kinds of like fatwas against her and she doesn't have bodyguards with her. And she said, look, if I'm telling Muslims to be bold and speak their minds, and they say, well, yeah, you can because you have protection. She goes, look, I'm out here every day. I'm writing, I'm talking, I'm speaking. And she says, I represent Islam too. So don't just look at Saudi Arabia, So it's all right, I know I need to end here because
Oh my, yeah.
People are about to start streaming church.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can get Pastor Jody to send out a link, maybe a survey monkey about things people would be interested in studying as we move into summer months. Or you can write on it like, heck no, I need a break, and you can like beg off too. So anyway, I will let you all go. It's great to see you all. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers.
Yeah.
And we'll figure out
Happy
what we're
Father's
doing.
Day.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
See you all.
Okay.
Dean, thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean.
Okay.
Bye.